Okay, good morning everyone. My name is Steve Woodrow. My name tag, even though I don't have one, says Georgia Institute of Technology right now, but I did this work, I just finished it at MIT with Karen Solons and David Clark. And what I want to be talking to you about today is this work that I did looking at the effectiveness of the CIDR report, the email that you guys receive every Friday, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. I think a lot of people have different opinions as to whether or not the CIDR report, does or don't work right now, whether it ever worked, and I hope to shed some light on this and also, offer some suggestions about ways in which it might be made more effective if it's something that operators do care about. So first, I'll be starting off with a bit of history about the CIDR report for people who weren't around during the classful to classless transition. And then talk about the approach that we used to figure out whether or not the CIDR report actually, was effective, the results that we found, some of the other observations that we made about the report that relate to this, the insights that we have about it, and then finally some conclusions about, whether it worked and what else we can do. And so I guess the other thing to note is a lot of people, in the past have talked about deaggregation. This report is not about deaggregation on its own, but it's about deaggregation in the context of the CIDR report. And so if you're interested in just deaggregation and, is it good or bad, how bad is it and what's causing it, I would encourage you to take a look at these presentations and papers here that I note below, as I found they were pretty good. So first off, a really quick history on the CIDR report for the people, as I said, who weren't around in the mid-90s or early 90s when this was going on. The genesis of the CIDR report was the transition from classful to classless addressing. And this, in turn, was motivated by, some BGP scaling problems and also the fact the initial allocation of between A's and B's and C's was not great. And so there needed to be a way to, instead of announcing 16 class Cs, you could just announce /20. So the IETF developed CIDR, classless interdomain routing, to deal with this. It was built into BGP4, and by the mid-1990s, as far as I understand, it was vendors had implemented it and it was available in routers. But then the next thing that actually needed to happen was behavior change on the part of operators. Operators needed to reconfigure their routers to, instead of announcing each block they have from Aaron as a class C or a class B, they needed to announce them as an aggregate, combining their contiguous blocks together. And so this is, the CIDR report was born out of this, to encourage operators to change the way that their routers were configured. So the earliest CIDR report was in the form of a top 10 list that appeared on the IETF CIDR deployment list. The earliest one I found was around 1994. Its relevance to Nanog, it moved to the Nanog list in September 96, and has basically been unchanged since then. It was initially launched by Tony Bates and Philip Smith of Cisco, and later moved to Jeff Houston stewardship in 2002. And so anecdotally, did it work, way back in the day? And it, we'll talk a little bit more about this more generally, but anecdotally, it appears that here's an unusual down and to the right plot of the routing table. This is very old. The numbers on the left are much smaller. But similarly, Jeff Houston noted in something he wrote in 2000 that the CIDR report, in his opinion, did provide good incentives for operators to improve their aggregation behavior. And so why did it work? This is sort of very hard to ascertain with any certainty, but talking to operators and other people in the community, these are sort of some of the things that they felt were the reasons why the CIDR report actually had the effect that it did on operators. First off, if you were just clueless and didn't realize that there was a better way that you could announce your routes, when your name popped up on the CIDR report, it provided some information to you about that. And then because it was sent to the entire Nanog list, and because everyone was able to see who the other top 30 were on the list, the social forces in this community were also able to have some effect on operator behavior. And so this includes, if you're worried about appearing on the report, you may feel some shame in wishing to maintain your reputation in the community and adjust your behavior. And even if you don't care, your peers may care about what you're doing, and so they apply peer pressure to you, in these meetings, on the mailing list, or in other dealings that you have with them. And then finally, there was this weird kind of hybrid of all three called the CIDR police that existed back in the late 90s and early 2000s that was talked about in Nanog 27, where they actually would call up people on the CIDR report and say, do you know you can announce your routes better, and work with them to deal with this. And so now we move forward to the present, and the question is the CIDR report still effective? And again, talking to operators and other people in this community, it seems a lot of people feel that the sentiments were like, it doesn't work anymore, but it did work some n years ago, and I heard, various numbers of n. Similarly, I think this is tangential, but some people think it doesn't really matter anymore because the scaling problem has been solved thanks to Moore's law, and I guess ostensibly we're done with the classful to classless transition, and so, again, maybe the CIDR report doesn't really matter. However, no one, as far as I could tell, had done any kind of empirical study to say, did the CIDR report actually cause people to change their behavior beyond anecdotes? And so this is where this work comes out of. So how do we define effective? How do we know that if the CIDR report actually caused a behavior change? So our hypothesis is that if the CIDR report works, and if this, if the social forces have an effect in causing people to wish to improve their behavior, then they should, once they appear on the CIDR report, their aggregation behavior should improve. So it's pretty simple, but this is what we're going to look for in the remainder of this. So this is in the red box here is, do you improve your behavior once you appear on the CIDR report? We look at aggregation behavior in two ways. I'm only going to talk about one here, and that's deaggregation factor. You can also look at it in the raw number of redundant prefixes that an AS is advertising, but I'm not going to talk about that here. So in terms of actually measuring the aggregation behavior of ASes, it would have been really nice to be able to just go to the CIDR report on the Nanog list archives, pull them, parse them, and say, does AS X drop once they first appear? However, because of the relative ranking of the CIDR report and the fact that it's only 30, it's really ambiguous what happens when someone drops off the 30. Did they actually get better, or did someone else just get worse and push them off the bottom? And so we actually had to re-implement the CIDR report. It was a little bit different than the version that Jeff Houston is using. We used route-fuse as our source of ribs. We fairly aggressively canonicalized the AS paths by removing prepending confederation sets and sequences, private AS numbers, and things like that. We ran the algorithm on each route-fuse peer, and if any peer found a prefix to be aggregable, we marked it as aggregable. And there were some differences between the reports, but they were generally reasonably consistent. So this plot shows the problem that we then have once we have all this data for every single AS, not just the top 30, is to figure out, once it appears, does its behavior change? And so the way we measure this is by sampling at various times once it appears. And so what this plot is illustrating here is this is for a single AS. The black curve, which jumps up at the beginning there, is the number of aggregable prefixes that the AS is announcing, and the gray bars in the background are its ranking on the CIDR report. So you can see in early 2005 for this AS, its aggregable prefixes jump significantly. It appears in the CIDR report, as shown by the gray bars, and then we take a bunch of samples from that first appearance point and a bunch of times thereafter out to 2 years. And also, we took advantage of this data to establish a control group. The reason for this is because we wanted to see, what is the behavior of ASs that never appear on the CIDR report? Do they also improve, or do they also not improve? And this is just to sort of, tease apart behaviors that may be, that affects all ASs versus behaviors that only affect the ASs on the CIDR report. And we did this with the same number of ASs that we randomly selected from the group of ASs that never appear on the report. And as I said earlier, there's two ways to look at this that I looked at it. I chose, and I will talk about in this presentation, deaggregation factor, which is a relative measure of how deaggregated, or how much aggregation potential there is for a given AS. It's the ratio of the number of prefixes that they're currently advertising into the table divided by the minimum number as determined by the CIDR report that they need to advertise to implement their routing policy. So the other way to look at it is net gain. This is the measure that the CIDR report uses, but it doesn't. This one, if you're a larger AS and you deaggregate more relatively, you're going to have a huge net gain, whereas deaggregation factor is more scaled to the size of your operations. And so with this, we're ready to go to the results and to see what we found over time. So in the next few slides, and I'm going to sort of build this up in a few pieces, I'm going to show you the way the improvement that we see for ASes that appear on the CIDR report in a bunch of different time slices. So this is 1998 to 2001. And so what we're looking at here is a CDF, a cumulative distribution function of the deaggregation factor across the population of ASes that ever appear on the CIDR report in this time. And for those of you who don't look at CDFs often, the way to read this basically is to pick a point. Oops. To pick a point, so you can say, let's say I want to say how much of the population has a deaggregation factor of 2 or less. So So you look up and to the left, you can say that 40% has 2 or less. And the other thing I should mention is this is the de-aggregation factor initially as soon as they appear on the CIDR report. So this is now the de-aggregation factor of the same ASes that appeared on the CIDR report 730 days, 2 years later, following that initial appearance. And so you can see that the curve has moved to the left. So using the same way of reading it as before, we can see if we go up to 2 and over to the left now, 80% of the population has a de-aggregation factor of 2 or less. So there has been an improvement in the de-aggregation that the population that appear on the CIDR report is currently doing. Now finally, quickly, the control group. So this is the ASes that never appeared on it. This is the CDF of them initially following the point at which we selected them. And then 2 years after that point, you can see that they tend to de-aggregate a little bit. So they move in the opposite direction that ASes on the CIDR report appear. And so we put these together, and we can see that there was a significant improvement of the ASes that appear on the CIDR report in this time period, and the control group moves the other way. So now we'll go ahead to the next time series, and so we can see that the behavior difference has changed a little bit. The control group looks the same, but the treatment group, the group of ASes that appear on the CIDR report, has decreased. Not much change in the next time period. And then finally, we move to the most recent time period. This is 2007 to 2009. And you can see that there's little change between their first appearance and 2 years after that first appearance in the group that appears in the CIDR report. And again, the control group remains roughly the same. So this would suggest that the CIDR, appearing in the CIDR report isn't associated with as much change as it once was. So interpreting this data, how do we interpret this? First, the control groups are consistent over time. So this suggests that there wasn't some change in behavior of all ASes. That the control group remained roughly the same, and so the behavior change we noticed seems to be associated with the ASes that appear on the top of the report. And as I mentioned, the improvement in the aggregation factor has decreased over time. So this suggests, and it's hard to be absolutely certain about this, but there wasn't a change associated with appearing on the CIDR report, and that change has since gone away. So if you believe that the CIDR report was what caused this behavior change, you could then conclude that it's probably no longer effective. There are some confounding factors here that I just should point out. First is selection bias, and this is basically because what this means is that the ASes that appear on the CIDR report may be intrinsically different than other ASes in the network, and indeed they are often large access providers or things like that. And so we may be measuring something else about them. This is difficult to control for. And similarly, regression to the mean. What this means is that when you appear on the CIDR report, you necessarily appear there because you're doing something weird, you're an outlier. And so it might be an accident, and then you go back to being normal. And it's possible that we could be measuring that return to normal rather than actually an improvement caused by the CIDR report. Again, these are difficult to control for because I'm using historical data and not something where we set up a nice controlled experiment. So if you believe the CIDR report once was effective and no longer, why did it change? Talking to operators, I've gathered a bunch of theories, and would certainly appreciate your thoughts as to whether you think these theories are reasonable or not. But the first, I think, is that rib and fib slots are much more plentiful now, and so there's less pain or concern about people injecting a few extra prefixes into the table, and conversely, you doing the same. There's just not the same motivation to be unhappy about it, especially because, as well, I believe the internet routing table does not dominate what people need to put in their fibs these days. Similarly, there is arguably, and I think people have different opinions on this, but there's arguably an increased need for deaggregation now, whereas this maybe wasn't the case in the early 90s. And finally, the community response, and this may be because of these first two things, but the community response to appearing on the CIDR report has changed, and that's what this plot down here shows. This is showing the frequency of emails regarding the CIDR report to the NANOG list from 1996 until now. Everything below that red line is the CIDR report email sent out by Jeff Houston or Tony Bates, and you can see that there was a decent amount of discussion in the early days, and this was, again, people calling each other out to say, so-and-so announced a whole bunch of prefixes that could be aggregated. It also included praise. So-and-so did a good job at reducing their prefix count. And this is, as you can see, since maybe 2005 with a few outliers, this has pretty much gone away. And so finally, we shift gears to the last part of this, and this is not looking at AS behavior anymore, but just some general observations about the report that we made that if you wanted to improve the report, this might be some things to look at. And the thing I would point out is that the CIDR report has remained, effectively unchanged since its origins in the mid-90s during the CIDR transition. And the internet has grown and changed. The number of ASes in the internet have, grown significantly, and yet the report has remained the same. And so it might, if the CIDR report is something that people still care about, it might be better to refocus it. And so the first plot I'll show you, this is another CDF, and what you're looking at here is the distribution of ASes announcing and how many prefixes that they are announcing that are deaggregated. And so the important thing to see here, I guess number one, is that the different colored bars, it looks like a rainbow, are the different distributions for different years of the routing table. As you can see that it hasn't changed much. It's not as though the top has changed and the people have become much worse. It's just the number of ASs in the system have grown. And what this means is that with the fixed top 30, the top 30 of 30-some thousand ASs now is much more extreme than the top 30 of a few thousand ASs back in the mid-90s. And this is illustrated with the two sort of lines at the very top on the left-hand side. You can see the top 30 1998 line was maybe at the 99th percentile, and it has since moved up to be less than 1/10 of 1%. And so you're really looking at extreme behavior because the CIDR report is still only top 30. And I can see why. I mean, it would be tedious to plod through a couple hundred entries in the CIDR report every week, but this is just one of the side effects of that. And similarly, the top of the report has become static. And what this plot shows is the number of prefixes that you need to, or the number of prefixes that you need to announce that are deaggregated in order to achieve a certain rank on the CIDR report. And so the top bar here is, if you want to be number one on the CIDR report, this is how many redundant prefixes you need to announce. So it's not insignificant. It's, you can see how it's changed over time as well. So the top 5 are the red to green bars. The blue is 10, the purple is 15, the median, and finally the bottom of the report is 30. So there's almost an order of magnitude change between the top and the bottom. And as I said, this may be because, indeed, there are large operators on the top, and so they may deaggregate, what might not be an unreasonable amount, but because they're large, they pop up to the top, and it's really hard to displace them. And so the top appears static, it appears not to change. So finally, seeing all this and seeing the fact that the CIDR report maybe is not doing as much as it did, the question is, should we do something about it? And I'm sure many of you have opinions about this, and I would love to hear them. But to me, it seems that it's unclear whether routing table growth right now is a pain point now, or whether it will be in the near future. Given the way that routers have been re-architected, and Moore's law and the fact that fib and rib slots seem to be relatively plentiful. Even if it did become painful, it's not clear to me that the CIDR report would be the best way to start dealing with this problem again. As was talked about, I think yesterday at the Brocade talk, and other people are working on it. Fib aggregation or compression are good ways of dealing with the problem of routing table growth within your own AS without requiring anyone else to do anything. And if we're going to dedicate effort to this as a community, we might be better off to spend our time trying to promote, and I agree, similar problems to IPv6, but promote a new routing architecture that scales better. But if the CIDR report rather is something that people are still interested in, still feel valuable, it might be possible to refocus it or to include other things in it that might lead to more actionable behavior. And so the first thing here would be, I would suggest that instead of putting the people on the top that maybe are unwilling to change or can't change, we can also look at low-hanging fruit, people that don't seem to have any reason to be, they're not the worst contributors to the routing table in an absolute sense, but it seems that they are not doing valuable deaggregation, or there doesn't seem to be any good reason why. Or similarly, people that are recent offenders, people that have not been on there but just sort of pop up, and thus might be sort of more susceptible to the suggestion to improve their behavior. And so I agree some of these things might be unfair, but I don't know that we can do that it would change. We can do sort of worse than we're doing right now. And so finally, to conclude, just to recap everything I've talked about, as I said, the CIDR report seemed to be effective in its early days. It's hard to tell, with causality to say that yes, the CIDR report was the cause of this change, but there was a behavior change associated with the Ases appearing on the CIDR report. This seemed to change over time, and as I mentioned, there's probably a number of reasons why, and probably related to the sort of change and evolution of the internet over time. The CIDR report, in contrast, hasn't evolved, which is fine, but if we wanted to improve it, we probably could improve it with focusing on different kinds of behavior. And finally, just to spend a moment on this, I do think we should not write off the social forces in, amongst the operator community as a way of changing behavior and dealing with things that don't have good, clean technical solutions. I think the fact that the NANOG meetings exist, the NANOG list, all of the discussion takes place on it, and you guys deal with each other in your own forums as well. I do think there's something to be said for the sort of social aspect to this in the cases where there's not an easy technical solution. And so I don't think we should be, these solutions are not easy when you want to do something like that, but I also don't think we need, should be absolutely pessimistic about using social forces to solve problems. And with that, I would leave you with a couple things. My email address, if you want to ask me a question or criticize me or send me some information. If you want to take a look at this URL, this is my thesis where it contains much more detail about all this. And finally, this picture, I thought it was kind of cool. This was our first attempt at visualizing the CIDR report. And so you can see the behavior change over time, kind of, and each color is a different AS. And so you can see the top's kind of static, the bottom's kind of volatile, but this wasn't ultimately that useful for what we were trying to do. And so with that, I'd love to take questions.
Okay, so please step up to the mics and identify yourself with your name and your affiliation, and we'll start over on this side.
Hi, my name is Jared Montz from New Century. So I have a couple comments. First of all, one, a year ago, there was a talk at the Atlanta NANOG about a similar topic, and Bell South, I specifically called out Bell South at the microphone there and was approached privately afterwards, indicating that this is part of integration efforts. It doesn't appear that they've made any progress over the past year. And so I would like to call them out again publicly, or ask that their parent company, AT&T, be able to go and take some action against them, and either aggregate that upstream for them, or take part in sort of those integration activities to go and suppress those routes, because that's about 3,000 routes or so that's in the table that doesn't need to be there. And I'd hope that they'd be able to do something about that. The second thing about the routing slot situation, I think that part of your assumptions are true to a point. With fib compression and some of the other techniques and algorithms that can be employed, we're actually approaching sort of the new wall. And the new wall that exists right now is going to be somewhere around the 512,000 routes entry, because a lot of people have switched to TCAM-based platforms for their forwarding, and they have specific partitions. And I think that we're going to see, us bump up against that, because you have people's internal routes as well as the externally visible ones that come into play in how that goes internally. And I think that 512 barrier is really going to be sort of the ceiling that we see for a period of time, as we continue to see the routing table growth as it is. And you should be able to project out when that's going to happen and when we're going to sort of bump against that. Some of the platforms you can carve it differently, but that requires maintenances or outages, and not everyone has done that, because that's a shared resource with other protocols like MPLS or IPv6.
So are people privately worried about this? Because is this suddenly going to hit us, or are people thinking about this internally and they just haven't talked about it as much?
I think in my prior role at a major carrier, this was definitely something that I thought about as it related to where the fib and rib was ultimately going to hit. And watching that growth curve, really the 512 barrier is really what concerned me the most, because you run into situations where you have to go and redeploy hardware. And when you're talking about major capital expenditures and the lead time and logistics associated with that, it becomes very complex. And so I suspect that as we approach some of those barriers, you're going to see a variety of forces at play. Either market forces may come into play with financial charging per routing slot, a la Sprint, or a la Sean Duran from 10 years ago, or you're going to see the players who can make a big difference actually going and trying to keep under that barrier as they approach it internally. So those are my comments about this. Thank you.
All right, over here, please.
Michael Sinatra, ESNet. Thanks for the analysis, actually. It occurs to me that this is just a brief, picky comment, the notion that the sort of social pressure has been taken off of operators to aggregate is more of an effect than a cause. And so I don't think it makes good sense to see that as a cause, but to see both the ineffectiveness of the CIDR report and the lack of social pressure as being an effect of something that we're trying to figure out. I think if we figure out what that thing is, then the analysis has a much more powerful message at that point. So that's really all I had to say at this point.
So we have to close the mics here. Next question on this side of the room.
Yeah. Martin Levy, Hurricane Electric. A couple of points. The report, as good as it is, and for the longevity it is, has never really addressed the fact that operators in certain parts of the world need to do traffic engineering, and their primary taught task is deaggregation. Now, that means that probably the high-end people on the report are probably going way past where they should, but the point is the report has always made this assumption that everything should be deaggregated down to the minimum allocation, minimum CIDR block, and be done with it. And that really isn't the case for a lot of operators out there. Second point is that, although this is in Phil Smith's report at the moment, AS path length prepending of excessive style is called out. And just from a peer pressure point of view, you can take some of the high-end players on that, do a personal email and say, hey, why are you doing this? Why can't you use some other control like communities and actually make a difference? So AS path length is really got a different processing issue than just dealing with the number of routes. Third thing is, there's a reality here. Upstream operators kind of like their customers with large deaggregations, because when they have lots of routes, they look bigger. And that simple pressure alone will continue. So it's unclear as you go up the chain that you actually have as much pressure as you believe you do back to the actual customer that's doing the deaggregation. The final point about just the size, and I'll talk about not the 512 side of it, but just the growth of this. Look at simple economics. Look at the barrier to entry in the marketplace. If a small operator can't afford a router with a large TCAM or memory size or processing to handle these big tables, then they're out of the game. So guess what? The people who have the money, people who can invest in this, and people who are willing to build large backbones will continue to not worry about the size of the routing tables. Yeah, personally, it doesn't feel good, but if it kicks one of my competitors out of the business, hey, I'm happy. That's economics.
Thank you.
Over here in the middle.
First of all, thank you. We're sitting out here going, data control groups. It's just a little weird for us, so appreciate you bringing some of this in. The CIDR report, you mentioned causality is very difficult to find. There's more than just whether the CIDR report made people drop their routes. I'm wondering if you have any plans. I know you changed schools and stuff, but do you have any plans to look at other effects? For instance, does being on the CIDR report in any way make someone filter you more stringently? Because even if you deaggregate, if everyone filters you, it's irrelevant, right? And there are other pressures that other people have brought up here, even at the mics, that have nothing to do with whether or not the person deaggregating aggregates or not. And then just to add on to something Martin said, one of these social pressures could be, for instance, to take the number of routes out of peering requirements. Large networks frequently say you must announce this many routes. That's very easy to do if you deaggregate, right? So maybe peer pressure can be, that is a stupid peering requirement. Of course, everybody probably knows I think every peering requirement is stupid, but that's beside the point. And finally, good luck with the next guy if you don't know who he is.
Yes, I was worried about this.
We're going to be brief because we're a little over on time.
Oh, okay, Jeff Houston, APNIC. Yeah, thanks for the work. And to be really brief, what's in the report is a combination of whatever I dreamt up, whatever Phil and Tony had done before, and the amount of stuff that you guys had wanted. To be perfectly frank, even though you could get this spam once a week, very few people have ever emailed me with what you want in it. So what you get is, you know, the combination of what you've asked for and not much else. So I'm certainly able to report on other stuff if you want other stuff in it. But, you know, tell me first, because otherwise it won't happen. Thanks.
Thank you.
Stephen, thank you for your presentation.